Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this My Finance Future webinar, hosted by the two co-founders, James and Richard. This is the second in a series of webinars about how to best use the My Finance Future Planner to help you build your own financial plan and enable you to take control of your financial future. Today's topic covers the next step in the financial planning process, how to test your financial plan. Richard will be leading us through the topic with a presentation and a case study demo. So let's get started. I'll hand over to Richard to lead us through the topic.
Great. Thank you, James, and welcome everybody to the second of our webinars. I'm just going to share my screen so we can get underway with the presentation. So, as James said, the topic today is how to test your financial plan. So, to move on to the agenda, we're going to go through the following. So firstly, understand why we should test our plan. It's very important before we get underway with the testing to understand why we're doing it in the first place so that we can make better decisions about both what to test and how we should test it. Then we'll go through briefly where testing sits in the financial planning process, relating it back to our previous webinar on how to create a financial plan and talk about where this fits in overall. And finally, we'll get into the meat of the discussion around what I should test, how I should test it, and then onto a demo of some of the tests using the MyFinanceFuture Planner. And finally, as James mentioned, we'll get onto Q&A and answer as many questions of yours as we have time available. So to start with, why should we test our plan? So as the image suggests, we test our plan because we face an uncertain future. We may be on a well-prepared path set out by our plan that we've worked on and created a vision of where we want to go, but we are aware that out there at any point something bad might happen, either from an economic perspective, a market perspective, or a personal perspective that might derail our best laid plans. So we should test our plan because we face an uncertain future. When we created our plan, we've probably either consciously or unconsciously been focusing on a sort of a median case, one where everything's normal. We've got a fairly average trajectory in terms of market growth, our personal life, and nothing out of the ordinary. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more during the presentation about understanding the assumptions behind your case and whether they represent a reasonable median case or not as a starting point for testing. Certainly when we've been setting up the MyFinanceFuture Planner and all the defaults and assumptions we make, that's been our starting point. So looking for a good average which represents a reasonable long-term expectation around an average outcome. So that's the starting point. But we know that adverse events will occur during our plans. And we know that because, well, generally speaking, our plans last for a long time. If we're planning in our 40s or 50s for the rest of our lifetime, our plan might last of the order of 40 to 50 years. And we know that over that period, some bad things will happen. Just looking back over the last 50 years, roughly speaking, every 10 years or so, there's been a market event where the stock markets have crashed by 20% or more, which would have had a significant effect on people's plans at that time. We know that over the next 40 to 50 years, similar things will happen. We don't exactly know when, we don't exactly know how by how much. We've got a fair amount of evidence from the past, which gives us some sort of idea of the relative frequency, and that there will be multiple of these events that happen over a lifetime. So we know that adverse events will occur. So the purpose of planning is really not to worry about whether they'll occur or not, but understand the impact of the events when they occur, so that we get an appreciation for how our plans respond to those events, and what we might have to do should the events occur to bring the plans back on track. So if there is a market event at some point at the start of our plan, it has an impact on our wealth, what would we need to do to bring our plan back on track? do we have enough set aside so that we can ride out the storm until things recover? If not, would we consider reducing our spending, changing our lifestyle until things are back on track? Would we consider returning to the workplace if we've retired, maybe in a part-time job? We've got to consider at that point what our earning potential is and what type of job we might get. Or do we find some of those outcomes or some of the things we would need to do unacceptable from our perspective? So are there things that actually we wouldn't want to happen or we wouldn't want to do in response to a typical event that might occur in the future? If that's true, then we'll need to consider changing our plan today to avoid those potential unacceptable impacts. So having done the testing, we may decide, okay, I can't deal with that potential outcome, so let's change my plan now so that I can avoid it happening. That might be build up more of a fund through working longer, saving more now, or maybe changing lifestyle plans in retirement. There's a variety of things we could do. One thing could be I'll try and reduce the impact of potential market changes by building up a withdrawal buffer so that I can ride out a storm more effectively, but maybe accept I'm not going to get quite so much upside in terms of better investment returns if the markets are better than expected. And in the end, why we're doing this is to give ourselves more peace of mind. So when we listen to the news in the evening and there's some news story about a major economic change, or we have a health update and maybe things aren't quite as good as we'd hoped, at least from a financial perspective, we have thought these things through and we understand what the impacts might be. We are prepared for any changes we might need to make in our lifetime, or we've done some preparation up front which reduce the impacts and make them acceptable. So we can reduce the amount of worry and stress from listening to the news every evening and give ourselves a bit of peace of mind. So where does this testing process sit into the overall financial planning process? So we went through this in our last webinar, and if you haven't yet watched that, I absolutely advocate watching it to get a better overview of the whole financial planning process. I won't go into detail of this now, aside to mention that the testing step happens after you've created your core plan and tailored it to your needs, and you're looking to fine-tune it to improve it, and at the same time test it to make sure it responds in the right way in adverse events. And there's an iterative process you go through at this point to both tune your plan, adjust it to deal with adverse events, and retune it to a point where you're happy with the outcome. So to look at that stage in a little bit more detail, we covered the Optimise part, which is really around making your plan more tax efficient and improving the overall financial outcome to some extent in the last call, and we'll cover it again later. We're not going to cover this at all today. We're going to focus on the testing part, the testing being looking at different scenarios that might derail our plan in three categories: market and economy, health, care and life expectation, and employment and career, potential redundancy, those sorts of things. And the scenarios you choose would depend on the stage of life you're at and where the biggest risks lie for you. So we'll go into more detail on that now. So before we get into the how, the first thing to think about is overall the general approach we're going to use. And I start off with this quote from Greg Davis. Greg's the head of behavioural finance at Oxford Risk, and somebody who spent his career thinking about how people, consumers, the general population makes financial decisions and how they can make good financial decisions. So he sort of thought through this whole process and is an expert on this area. This quote is, I think, very, very powerful and helps guide our overall thinking about testing. So testing is about sufficiently clear answers to what we really want to know when we might run out of money, can be calculated with simple tests under a few understandable scenarios. And I think the key things here are simple tests and understandable scenarios, because they help us understand what we're doing, what we've tested for, and as a result, what our actions will be. It's more useful to have done that because it changes our way of thinking, gives us more reassurance. There are quite a lot of models out there that offer to test your plan using a statistical approach, in that the statistical models can help you understand how well your plan responds to different market conditions and in what and how often it might fail. But the things they don't do, generally speaking, are to cover personal events. So they focus primarily on the market in most cases. They don't look at things like redundancy or shorter life expectancy or longer life expectancy and other things which have the potential to derail your plan. They can be difficult to understand, so the assumptions can be somewhat black box and their implications can be difficult to understand for the layman. And finally, they don't encourage you to go through a process of understanding how you would respond in the event some of the scenarios occur that would result in the plan failing. So they don't really expose the particular set of circumstances under which the plan would fail, and encourage you to go through a process of understanding how you respond to that failure, and as we discussed earlier. So I would advocate Greg's approach of testing your plan with a few simple tests under well understood scenarios which you understand yourself. So how would we go through that process? And this is what we're going to cover in the rest of the presentation and demo, the process of testing your plan on this basis. So start off by reviewing your assumptions. The MyFinanceFuture Planner, if you're using MyFinanceFuture to do your testing, makes a range of assumptions about return rates, economy, tax rates, growth rates of various assets, which it's important to check to make sure they reflect your beliefs about the future and represent a reasonable median case as a starting point for your testing. Second stage is around choosing scenarios. We wouldn't advocate testing every scenario unless you've got a lot of time and want to cover all your bases, but focus on those ones that have the most potential to derail your plan given your situation. And choose 3 or 4, say, which are the ones which you believe you're most worried about, and or through some consideration give the most risk to your plan. Once you've chosen them, you need to decide how you're going to model them in the planner, if you're using the MyFinanceFuture Planner to do your testing, or in whatever planning tool you're using, and create separate scenarios. Input the scenario, then work out how you'd respond to the impacts that creates, and draw some conclusions. And having gone through that process for each of your scenarios, make a decision about whether or not any of those result in unacceptable outcomes that you are not happy to address at the time through adjusting your plan, but want to make some adjustments to your base plan to mitigate them should they occur, and then go through the process of updating your base plan. So that's the overall process. There are some principles which we'd encourage people to adopt. First is create a separate scenario, model it as a separate plan, using your core plan as a basis for each of the scenarios you're modeling and designing your response for. Pick just a few scenarios and keep them simple. So make the big changes that have the greatest impact, but don't do too much to model it in a very sophisticated way so that the process is easier to repeat at a later date, because this is not just a one-time process. You'll test it maybe now, but in a couple of years' time, before a significant decision or life event, you might want to test it again, and we'll show that scenario with our case today. The third is where you spend your time, and I'd absolutely advocate spending your time around your response, so step 3, because it's very important to have time to consider what your genuine response would be should the adverse event occur. It stops at that point. It should stop becoming a completely rational exercise, because because it is genuinely an emotional decision. If you're making a real decision about your future, you need to connect with it emotionally as well as just rationally. How would you really respond in the situation should it occur? You can't make those decisions instantaneously. Almost consider it a little bit like you would if it were to occur in reality. Give yourself a bit of time to think and try and connect with how you'd really respond in those situations. Finally, it's important to consider how extreme to make the scenarios you're testing. If you make them too extreme, there is a risk that you compromise your plan through a very unlikely scenario, which might be inappropriate for you. So it's important to consider how to balance that. One example to think about is the market crash scenario. This is very easy to conceptualize. The worst case in terms of timing, typically for a market crash scenario, is when you are just about to start your withdrawal phase, maybe just as you retire, and a market crash occurs immediately after retirement. There's no way back into employment easily, and suddenly your fund is devalued by 20+%. So in terms of timing, that's as bad as it can get for most people. So the question is whether you should model bad timing and the worst case in terms of the scale of the crash. That would be an extremely unlikely scenario. That's not to say some people didn't go through it. So some people retired just before the credit crisis, for example. So people do go through that situation. The question is whether you should model that combination and plan for that, or whether you should choose something slightly less extreme, maybe worst case in terms of timing, but bad case, but not worst case in terms of scale of the crash. So important to go through that process, consider your risk appetite, how much protection you want, and choose scenarios that are appropriate. Okay, so we're going to go into our case study. For those that watched the previous webinar, we're using Tom and Barbara, whose plan we put together in our last case study. We've moved them 5 years on. So Tom is now just approaching his planned downshift to go part-time. The kids have left home or gone to university, and they've almost paid off their mortgage. So it's quite a key decision point. One year left before a big decision about Tom stepping back from full-time work and going part-time. So wants to test his plan to make sure he's ready for that. So the first stage is to review our assumptions. So this is stage 0 of the process we looked through earlier. And the point here is to make sure the plan is a good baseline. I believe in the assumptions. They represent a sensible median case so that I understand the baseline from which I'm doing my tests. So we're going to look through the planner now and look at Tom's plan and check some of those assumptions to see if they're reasonable and whether they provide a reasonable basis to start from. When we do this, we've got to think about a few things. First is think about the long term. So as we mentioned earlier, the plans can be 40 to 50 years long. Tom's case, he's got 35 years planned duration. Barbara's planned longevity is 35 years. So the values we put in have to be long term. We've got to think about, say, for inflation, we in the UK we've experienced high inflation for the last couple of years, but 2 years in a 35-year period are a relatively short period and don't affect the long-term average very much. So we have to think about that when setting the median values in the planner, and treat any major deviations from that as maybe a case or a scenario to test, rather than treat it as something we put in there for the long term based on maybe current values. Second is try to be objective. We've all got some views about the economy and what should and shouldn't happen. Good example, which we'll go into, is the state pension. State pension's been linked to triple lock for the last quite a while now, a couple of decades, but most commentators would say over the long term that's probably unsustainable given an aging population, constraints on government spending and all the rest of it. There are political challenges around changing that. However, at some point there's likely to be a change because the economy won't be able to bear it. And how that happens, we don't know. There's a variety of possibilities. there are some political parties talk about means testing pensions. The Danes have just moved their state pension age back to 70, and we're talking about moving maybe from triple lock to something like average wages indexing as an alternative to reduce the longer term growth in government spending. So there's a variety of scenarios. However, it's important to come to a balanced view about what is the scenario you'd take as your median case, rather than allowing too much personal bias to influence that. And the final point is around optimistic arguments. Looking through the assumptions made in the planner, you may consider that some of them are too pessimistic, and you'd have a more bullish perspective, say, on long-term equity growth, or maybe house price growth in your region, because you expect it to be above average for the next maybe 10 or 20 years. So there's some things where it's possible you'd have a reasonable, more optimistic view than the planner starts with. Okay, so let's take a look at the planner now, and we'll go into Tom's plan. So as we can see from the results screen here, Tom's plan succeeds. This is where we left him at the end of the last webinar, but moved 5 years forward. So he's just about to downshift. So you can see the earnings drop here in the second year of the plan. So if we go and edit the plan, we can have a look at some of the assumptions. So the first one's around longevity. That's set here in Me and My Family, and Tom's plan's set so that both he and Barbara are on the 50th percentile from longevity expectations. Some people might model their core case as a 25%, so they expect to be older. The ONS statistics that we are the basis for the planner's longevity percentages are quite a blunt tool. So I know that if I go onto the Princeton longevity modeler and put in more information about myself in terms of health profile, lifestyle, those sorts of things, you end up with a higher longevity expectation as the average, as the median case. So it's worth thinking about what the right answer is for you based on your profile. For Tom and Barbara, they're comfortable with a 50% and might consider modelling longer or increased life expectancy as one of their cases, one of their scenarios. Then we'll look at assets and debts. The key things to think about here are typically the growth rate. So what's the expected growth rate in your home valuation? What's your anticipated mortgage rate over the long term, depending on how long you have left on your mortgage? Tom and Barbara's case, they've got 1 year left. Their current fix is going to cover that period, so they don't need to worry too much about long-term interest rates. If you think that the current rates are slightly higher than they will be in a few years' time, then maybe you can adjust that average down. On the house prices, the assumption the planner makes is based on the ONS's view that long-term house prices are linked to growth in average weekly earnings in the UK. But as we know from recent house price trends, some areas of the country are growing faster than others. At the moment, Northern Ireland's one of the fastest growing areas, and London has experienced some house price devaluation over the last couple of years. So there's variation. So it's important to think about context and what's appropriate for you. On earnings and pensions, a couple of things I'd highlight. On earnings, again, earnings growth is based on your job, the level within your job, historical trends in wage growth, and whether you expect to have any promotions. You might tweak the growth expectations around earnings. And back to the state pension, Tom in particular is concerned about expectations around growth in state pension, doesn't believe triple lock will stay in place, and assuming that would be too optimistic. In particular, he's concerned about that assumption for Barbara, because Barbara's younger than he is and has several years in the plan beyond their their expected longevity, so is more likely to be impacted by a change in that factor. Because it's not easy to model a change partway through the plan, Tom's going to compromise by changing Barbara's expectation so that she experiences a lower growth in her state pension over the course of the plan, as a way of balancing it out between his plan being based on triple lock and hers being based on average weekly earnings, which is his way of doing this. So we'll save that change. Then in savings and investments, the main thing to think about is the growth rates. So we've got 5.5% as a portfolio growth rate in here. Tom's chosen not to model out his asset allocations. These in the planners in the planner, these growth rates are based on growth rates taken from the Financial Reporting Council, who set the standards for workplace pension valuations and valuing workplace pension liabilities. So they're a reasonably balanced but perhaps conservative set of rates. You might have a different view on this and be comfortable with maybe slightly higher growth rates as your central case. The last thing to look at as we go through the assumptions is in the assumptions section. So a couple of things to look at here. We'll look at inflation. So these are taken from the most recent long-term forecasts from the OBR, the set of assumptions currently used in projecting forward government spending, tax rises, those tax takes and those sorts of things. You may decide you want to change these, have a slightly less optimistic view of long-term inflation. Some people model at 2.5% rather than 2%. The other thing to look at is taxation. So the planner bases its tax model on what's currently in place as legislation through the most recent budgets, and the government's declared legislated future changes in taxation. So, for example, on income tax, we can see here that the so-called fiscal drag around the personal allowance being fixed until 2028 is modelled in the planner. You may consider that the government won't change the personal allowance for a longer period than that. When it comes to it, it will keep the cap on the personal allowance beyond 2028. And if you want to model that as your central case, you can do that by overriding the core assumption and changing that date. So let's see what affects that one change to Barbara's indexation of the state pension income has on the plan. So that has affected the outcome. So Tom's found that change now gives them a shortfall at the end of the plan, but he's happy that that's a reasonable basis on which to make the plan. So is now going to have to think about how he adjusts his plan to make it successful with that change. So he decides to bite the bullet and carry on working full-time for one more year before he downshifts. So it was good to have done this exercise before making that decision concrete. So we'll go back in and edit the plan and adjust Tom's downshift date. So we'll move that back a year and move his downshifted job back a year as well and see if that's fixed the problem. And indeed it does. So now Tom's plan is projected to work again, and he's accepted his change in downshift date. So we'll now flip back to the presentation and look at the next step, having checked our assumptions and got comfortable with the core case. So the next step is to choose the scenarios we want to test, and this is a list of scenarios that we start with. If you go to the if you want to sort of be talked through this process as you use the planner, there's a section of the planning guide within the planner that talks through this stage in the financial planning process, identifies the potential scenarios and gives some guidance around how to model them within the planner. For now, we'll just look through them. So the ones we focus on are life expectancy, either shorter or longer. So longer where you have to fund a longer retirement, or shorter where maybe the one of the breadwinners in the family dies young while still working, while still earning, and the family has to deal with a loss of an income. We have the health shock around either working age health shock, which means you can't work for a period, maybe get some loss of earnings which aren't fully compensated by insurance or benefits, or later in life you find you have a need for long-term care, which obviously has a cost associated with it, and need to deal with that cost later on. There's an employment consideration, especially if you're still have quite a period to go until your expected retirement, where you might have to deal with a period without an income, maybe an unexpected redundancy, and a period of time taken to find your next employment, and whether or not that employment would fulfill your full income that you have today. So those types of considerations and how you'd model that. Finally, on the economic side, we have market crash, we have a property crash or correction, and on the property side, we've talked a bit about the market side, but the property side, it's worth considering both national factors, but also probably more important for property, local factors. So are there any things that would make your situation at higher risk because of local property price factors, or maybe your specific property where there's any risk around that and that you'd want to plan for as a particular scenario? There's an interest rate spike, or inflation surge. So the situation back in the 70s is the example that many people would remember, where we had stagflation and interest rates going up to 25% at times, and inflation in the double digits for an extended period. So those types of things are scenarios you should consider. And finally, just a systematic lower average rate of return over the period of retirement, which would potentially affect the outcome. So which ones will we look at for today? Today, we've got time to cover two in some detail. So we've decided to choose the later life health and longer term care scenario, and secondly, the market crash at retirement, which causes a devaluation in your investments. So let's take the later life care scenario first. So we're going to model that by an increase in expenses for a period of time towards the end of the plan. It's more often the second partner to the surviving partner who's the one who experiences long-term care, because they don't have their partner with them to look after them in the home. And so we're going to plan it for Barbara at the end of the plan. The average, and there's research on this, which James will send you a link to if you're interested in looking into it. The average for people who do require long-term care, and it's only a proportion of the population that do, is roughly £200,000 over a 3-year period. That's a typical situation for us, for the proportion of the population that do need care. So we're going to use that as the basis for the model. So let's flip across to the planner. We'll go back to the dashboard, and the way we're going to do this is create a duplicate copy of our core base plan. Name it appropriately. And we'll go in and edit that. And as we discussed, the way we're going to model that is through an expense at the end of the plan. So we'll add a life event, and we'll start that in the last 3 years of the plan and end it in the last year of the plan, giving us 3 years of expenses, and we said £65,000 a year for full-time live-in carer. So let's see what impact that has. Okay, so it's given us a shortfall at the end of the plan, as we can see here, due to the higher expense. So we need to think about how we deal with that. And the way Tom and Barbara decide to deal with that is to plan at the time to release some equity from their home. They've paid off their mortgage or expect to pay off the mortgage within the next year at the start of the plan. So they've got a fair amount of equity built up, which they aren't currently planning to use, and it would be passed on as part of their legacy. So they're going to plan to draw on that if this situation were to arise later in the plan. So let's see if they can draw enough equity down at that point and what impact it would have by modelling that out. So we'll go back in and edit the plan. We'll go into assets and debts, and to model that, we'll need to look at their home, which we currently see is disposed at the end of the plan. So we'll need to get rid of that disposal and add a later life mortgage. And we're going to add a lifetime mortgage so that the interest is accumulated and paid off at the end through the sale of the home. We'll start that in the year that we've said, oh, we need to make it Barbara as the mortgage owner. She's the survivor at that point. And we'll add it in the year that we're modelling Barbara going into care or taking on care. And we did a little offline calculation that said we'd need £500,000, or £500,000 of mortgage would be enough. And looking at the current lifetime mortgage rates are in the 6 to 7% range. So as a proxy for being able to predict what they will be in 30 years' time, we'll put in the current rate. Okay, so one thing I forgot to do was add in a sale at the end of the plan to deliver the capital to pay off the mortgage. So let me just go back in and do that before we look at the outputs. So I'll add a disposal, and we'll just put no disposal costs at the moment, because we're not interested in detailed modelling of the inheritance tax bill, just that the plan works overall. So we can see that that sale was sufficient to fund the later life care and understand how we deal with that at the time should that situation arise.
So Richard, we had a comment in the chat asking about the compare feature. Could you just quickly perhaps just do a compare of this plan versus the base plan that we started with, just to show how that would work?
Yeah, so let's do that. Okay, so we can do that by bringing up the base plan, which was this one. So just I'll expand that so it's easier to see. Oops. Oh, that's already at full. So you can see the difference in terms of the spending at the end of the plan. That brown column is the mortgage coming in and being used to fund the first year's care expenses. Hopefully that illustrates how you can use the comparison to show how the plan varies between the test case and the base. So we'll just exit the full screen and go back to here, and we'll now look at the second case. So if I go back to the dashboard, and we'll go back to the presentation to look at the second case. So the second case is the market crash, and the way we model that is through a reduction in investments at the start of the plan, and as well increase in the rate of return after the crash to model the mean reversion that happens. In technical terms, a mean reversion. So you get a bounce back in valuations so that they come back to the mean after a major devaluation. So it would be, we consider it a bit too pessimistic just to model a crash without modeling some mean reversion alongside it. So in Tom and Barbara's case, they have a mixed equity and bond portfolio. Looking back at the cases from the past, looking at the top 5 drawdowns or devaluations as a result of a crash in the last 50 years, there's apart from one outlier on the downside, the average is around 15% for a mixed equity and bond portfolio. So we've chosen to use that one at the worst time, so just before retirement, rather than model the worst devaluation at the worst time, which seemed too extreme. Obviously, if your risk profile's different, you prefer to model the absolute extreme case, that's absolutely fine. It's everybody's individual choice what we do, but Tom's decided the thing to do is to model a 15% drawdown. So we'll do that. So we'll make a copy of the plan for this case. And we'll go in and edit that. So the place to edit that is in savings and investments. We'll go through the individual accounts and adjust their values down by 15%. So just looking at my offline calculations, 66,000 for Tom's ISA. For his pension, it's gone down to 442 as a result of the crash. Barbara's pension is down to 55 and Barbara's ISA down to 22. And then we'll go into the returns and we'll tweak the gross return that Tom's experiencing to 6%, increase it by 0.5% so that it reflects the reversion of the growth rate after the crash. And we'll also note, because Tom picks it up, that the annual fees here are 1%, which he thinks are higher than he's actually experiencing, but that might be a useful piece of information that we can come back to. But for now, let's just run that and see what the impact is. And sure enough, the effect of the crash at the start of the plan is to create a shortfall for 3 years at the end of the plan. So Tom needs to do something about that or decide how he would respond. And it's going to be difficult for him to justify leaving things until the end. He's going to have to do something so that there's some money left at the end of the plan to fund later life expenses. So what will he do? Well, he remembers the fee rate. So the first thing he can do is make an adjustment to that to reflect actually the fees he's paying. So let's do that and see if that goes partway to solving the problem. And he looks at his investment documentation for his pension, his ISA and Barbara's, and sees that the average is actually 0.6% because he's got most of it in low-cost workplace pensions and low-cost trackers. So he can justify reducing that to 0.6% and see if that helps. And in fact, it goes so far as to eliminate the shortfall, which is great from Tom's perspective, and also illustrates the power of compound interest to cover that shortfall by that small adjustment, seemingly small adjustment of 0.4% in fees. So Tom's feeling pretty happy about that. He's sort of accepted that he's going to have to carry on working full time for another year to allow for state pension uncertainty, but is happy that he can deal with a market crash without too much trouble, because he's not paying as many fees as he thought he was in the planner. So that's that part at least is good news. So with that, we'll just skip back, and that's the end of the demo. So we'll open it out to questions and answers. James, have we got any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I've been answering them pretty much as we've been going through. I think Mark and Tony have asked about whether the planner supports sort of modelling a kind of an event at a future date, and sort of building the and being able to input a set of returns around that future date. So I just commented that that's not currently possible in the planner, but it's certainly on our enhancement list to offer that feature, which will allow you to sort of model these events at a particular point in the future, perhaps where there's more likely to be a larger impact, and then to kind of control the sort of the mean reversion aspect of it a little bit better.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, we've got a couple of points coming in. So this is from Mark about how does the planner allow a gilt ladder to be modelled, which might be used to protect against the last scenario that we saw. Can you comment a little bit on that, Richard?
Yeah, so that question has come up a few times before, and we suggest people model a gilt ladder as a taxable investment account, and with an allocation to bonds and a return corresponding to that, and you can adjust your withdrawal strategy so that the gilts are drawn on at the appropriate point in the cycle, and set a return allocation to cover the gilts capital gains tax exemption. So it'd be interesting to get further feedback on that question as you use the planner to test your plans. We've got that as the current recommendation, but we'd appreciate any further feedback on that point, because we're currently going through some development work on allowing more tailoring of the contributional withdrawal strategy, so you can develop a more tailored approach to that, and looking for input on what particular scenarios people are looking to model. So that's that would be useful to get your thoughts on.
A quicker one here. Can you show where you can see the total lifetime tax paid over the plan?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the planner.
Jump back into the demo.
Yeah, so the place to see total lifetime tax is if you go to the KPIs. We call them the KPIs at the top of the results screen. There's an option here to look at the expenses of which tax is a part, and that the last box here shows you the total taxes, and that's split into the ones you pay during your lifetime, on income, on capital, and then legacy, which is IHT, inheritance tax.
So Tracy's sort of asked the question. So supposing you did implement a cash buffer in the plan, would you actually see the effect of that in the scenario that we've just looked at?
So you would, because if you were to implement a cash buffer at the start of the plan, with maybe 3 years of cash, when you adjust the valuation, the values of the non-cash investments at the start of the plan, you wouldn't touch the cash. So that's how you would see it. You'd sort of model it by having an increased amount of cash at the start of the plan, smaller amounts in investments, and when you model the crash, you just reduce the amounts of the non-cash investments.
So Peter has asked a question. The models talk about an average case under planned sustainability. So that's in the sort of yellow box on that results page. Is there any sort of function graph or feature that shows the variance from that average?
So not at the moment, and the way we'd advocate it's really there as a reminder that this is an average case, and to do that as a result of that, this sort of testing process is important to see how the plan responds to different non-average scenarios. We would advocate using, as well as one of the scenarios, a case where you adjust the overall rates to a slightly more pessimistic view to see how your plan responds to that. And in fact, there is the option to choose a slightly more pessimistic set of numbers for the rates of return and inflation in the assumption section.
I've got a couple of comments, not really questions. Any further questions? We've had quite a batch in the last few minutes. Please put your hand up if I haven't covered them. So I think we're probably done for today. Thanks very much, Richard, for taking us through that.
You're welcome.
And thank you to everyone on the call for joining us today. And we hope you've taken some useful ideas from the session that you can apply to your own planning process. I think Richard mentioned that we're planning further webinars in the coming months, and the next one's most likely to be about the Optimise step that's in our planning approach, which several people have asked about. So please keep an eye out for the invite to that, perhaps in the early autumn. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's webinar, and indeed on topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars once we've completed this set of sessions around the general planning process. Pop your thoughts in the chat before you leave. Use the Contact Us feature in the planner, or post to our Facebook community page, which is out there and available for everyone to use. Thanks again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future.